And I've heard the criticism, and you know, it frustrated me a little bit, because I wish that I had the luxury, you know, having experienced homelessness myself, of saying, well, sorry, you're too privileged to be able to help out with this. You can't underestimate how powerful it is to be able to get people around the table. And that's what he's able to do brilliantly. And I've seen it in Technicolor. That when you were saying that, because I was like, I've been there, I know what you mean.
It's just the world's so messed up.
I know.
And you kind of forget until you have kids. Hi everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of a Right Royal podcast with me, Andrea.
And me, Emmy.
In this episode, we're taking a deep dive into the Prince of Wales's new ITV documentary, Prince William, We Can End Homelessness.
We'll be joined by an incredible guest, Dr Sabrina Cohen-Hatton, who appears in the documentary and is working with the Prince as an advocate for his Homewards initiative.
Sabrina has the most amazing story, and we'll be hearing all about it later in the episode. But first, let's catch up with Hello's royal editor, Emily Nash, about the latest royal news.
Let's welcome Emily.
Welcome.
Hello, fancy seeing you here.
Again. Now, where do we begin? There's lots to talk about today, but why don't we start talking about King Charles and Queen Camilla's royal tour of Australia and
Samoa.
Samoa, that's it.
Yes, it's been really interesting, hasn't it? Strange for me watching it from afar this time around. And
Did you get FOMO?
I did get a bit of FOMO, apart from on day one when it was very, very rainy. But it looks like it has on the whole been really a lovely tour, but with a few incidents.
Oh yes,
we're going to address the elephant in the room.
Yeah. I think we'll discuss that in a moment. But first of all, I think we need to hear from our colleague Tracy Chevrion, who joined the King and Queen down under.
This is Hello's Tracy Chevrion, and I've been lucky enough to join King Charles and Queen Camilla in Australia, where they've been here on tour. So, just looking back at the last few days and what's been going on, I would say it's been a largely positive tour, and it seemed to go very well, actually. And my feeling was that from a lot of people not really knowing that they were coming in the beginning, momentum has really built up over the last few days. The crowds lining the streets and other public places has really just swelled, and so much so actually that today, which was their last day in Australia, at Sydney Opera House, there were 10,000 people, and they stood out in the sun for hours. You know, some of them were there for 8 hours or more, just hoping to meet the royal couple and hoping to get a glimpse and soak up the atmosphere, which it was a really good atmosphere, actually. There was music playing and flags waving, and it was a really nice afternoon. And there's been more of that as well when they went to church on their first official day of engagement. Again, crowds of people wanting to meet them, wearing crowns. And it was the same actually in Canberra when they went there. Obviously, there was a little bit of a downside, as many of you might have heard. And when the King was in the Australian Parliament with the Queen in Canberra, he was heckled by a First Nations senator who feels very strongly that there needs to be a debate about the colonial history of Britain in Australia. And it does seem to have sparked quite a debate here. While it was a fairly unpleasant spectacle, shouting inside Parliament, the King, I think, probably half expects these kind of things to happen. He's always very calm. We were told he was unruffled. And indeed, he did just keep talking to the Australian Prime Minister, who was sitting next to him, as if nothing was going on, and then moved on very quickly. So that, I think, shows how professional he is and the years of experience he's had at handling awkward situations. Now, there were lots of very Australian things happening. A big community barbecue in one of the most diverse communities in Sydney. There was also a visit to an Indigenous centre, and actually throughout the visit there was acknowledgement of the First Nation Indigenous people. There was a didgeridoo and a dancing display in Parliament. There were lots of smoking ceremonies, which is like a traditional welcome by the Indigenous elders. So that was always quite colourful and interesting to watch. Among the more fun elements was a big community barbecue in the west of the city, which is one of the most diverse areas of Sydney. And Charles and Camilla were turning a few sausages on the barbie, watching a sheepdog display, and meeting a lot of people, which has been the overwhelming mood here. Lots of meet and greet, lots of people excited to see them. There's also been some official stuff going on. So, as I mentioned, the Australian Parliament in Canberra and also the New South Wales Parliament in Sydney, and various other sort of official things that were going on in government buildings. There are also a chance for the King and Queen to see some of the charity work that's going on here. So the next stage of their tour is to fly to Samoa, which is a few hours away by plane. And that is for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting as the leader of the organisation. So he will be seeing world leaders coming in from all over the world, Commonwealth nations, and that will be another thing to watch.
Oh, it sounds like she's having such a good time.
Is it just me, or was I getting a bit of an Aussie accent there? There's a little twang.
I mean, it is always lovely to hear about these things, isn't it? But I also know that it's a bit tough behind the scenes. You know, there's a lot of jet lag.
She's missed a bus. We know she missed a bus. She told us.
She left her laptop on a bus.
Oh, no. Didn't you leave a laptop somewhere once?
Yeah, I've been known to occasionally misplace belongings while on tour. Let's just leave it at that, shall we?
I definitely remember something about you writing a 2,000-word feature on your phone. Yeah, very impressive.
Been there and done that.
She can do it all, folks.
I know. But look, it's been really interesting. And, you know, she's mentioned in that this incident that happened at the Australian Parliament, Senator Lydia Thorpe saying what she really thought about the monarchy. You know, it's a legitimate topic of discussion, isn't it? But I think that my understanding is that a lot of people on the ground didn't like the way that it was done.
No.
I thought it was not very good.
Disrespectful, I think, is the word that a lot of other politicians used about it. And it's such a tricky one for King Charles. You know, he, and I've witnessed this many times, on visits to places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, spends a lot of time with Indigenous communities. He's made it very clear that he's there to listen and he wants to be part of those conversations. But he's also completely hamstrung by the UK government, because any question of reparations for historic slavery, for example, or any other colonial issues, which, let's not forget, date back a very long time, are ones that can only be dealt with by the government. So whatever the king feels about this situation, and we know he feels deeply about it, you know, he's spoken about slavery, he's spoken about, you know, the need to heal the past, and it's something he has not shied away from at all, but he doesn't have that call to make. He can't. So he's kind of really between a rock and a hard place, isn't he?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because like you said, it's incredibly valid, very valid. And Charles is a figurehead of, you know, and but also he doesn't have any real power, and it's the government, our government, that should be getting, you know, should be facing this. And I think maybe there's something in it as well, just what I can bear to watch and can't bear to watch, and someone shouting at
an elderly, unwell person, regardless of who they are, like, it's not a good look.
Valid or not, I find that very hard.
He reacted very well, though.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't agree with what it was done, but this is not the first time that it's happened to them. I mean, let's not forget
he's withstood a lot of heckling.
I mean, when he became king, I remember that walkabout where someone threw an egg at him.
Oh my God.
I mean, it didn't hit him, but still, it wasn't very nice.
I mean, he's been shot at in the past.
I remember that.
I can't even begin to imagine, you know, being in that position and knowing there are people out there who actively will target you in that way. But what I think is interesting, and from all the conversations that I've had with the palace about this over the years, is that it's very clearly the king feels a decision for the Australian people to make themselves about what happens in terms of their connection to the monarchy, about you know, the historic connection to Britain. And let's not even get into, and I'm sure some of our Australian viewers and listeners will have thoughts about this, but, you know, Australia held a referendum to decide on whether Indigenous people should have greater rights, and it didn't pass. Yeah. So I can understand why there's a lot of frustration there among Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
It's not something, though, as we say, that the king can magic away.
You know, if you are Australian and listening, like, give us a shout. Like, comment on our YouTube channel. I'd love to hear their thoughts.
Thinking about
down
it,
under.
Actually, it's probably worse that this has happened. That this was done by a senator, I think, because normally it would be by someone from the public, and but actually a senator. I mean, she should know.
Yeah, although apparently she's known for
this
her sort of protest, but I think it was unfortunate that it was done immediately after his speech, in which he talked about how much he valued, learning from Indigenous communities. So on the one hand, he's sort of acknowledging them. He can't apologise for things that were done by his ancestors 300-400 years ago. Although there are other people who have done, but he is equally, representative of our country as well as Australia. It's such a difficult one for him.
Yeah.
But then maybe her argument is that he, just shouldn't have been there at all, really, making speeches. So it's a tough one. It's a fundamental disagreement, isn't it, really?
Yes.
So.
Now, obviously, sadly, this event did take up a lot of headlines, but it has been a great tour. Like, they have been welcomed by thousands of people, and it has been visually amazing, like the pictures, and we've been sent, obviously, videos by our colleague Tracy, and we've been keeping in contact with her daily. They've been very well greeted.
They have. They've had a very warm response to the visit. And, we have to remember that Queen Elizabeth was almost kind of revered, not just in this country, but all around the world. And I think that was what was also interesting. I think that there was a kind of an unspoken that people weren't going to protest in her lifetime. There was there was sort of respect for her longevity and her position in world history, I suppose. But, you had 10,000 people outside Sydney Opera House there to greet him. You had these lovely moments of them doing the rainforest walk, taking part in the community barbecue. I mean, can you get more Australian than that? I don't know. And then Charles also going to visit the Indigenous Centre for Excellence in Sydney. And, he was addressed there about the problems of Britain's colonial legacy, but in a way that was part of a conversation rather than sort of hurling of abuse at him. And my understanding is he's receptive to these conversations. He obviously does feel responsible in some ways, and he wants to listen to people and understand it more.
Now, obviously, the royal landscape has been quite quiet. Now, we know that when there's a royal tour, they kind of let the royal tour...
They go dark. Everyone else...
They go dark. They let the royal tour shine. So, and obviously it's half term here for the viewers and listeners that are not in the UK. So those with children are taking kind of a little step back. But there are news about the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, which I wanted to ask you about. Now,
yes. So this is really interesting. This was a story that appeared in the UK newspapers about a week ago about Harry and Meghan buying a property in Portugal. My understanding is that it may not quite be a done deal. There's some sort of process going on, but they certainly are interested in Portugal.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
They vacated in Portugal, as far as we know?
They have. They spent 3 days there straight after the Invictus Games in Dusseldorf. They, I believe, stayed with Princess Eugenie and Jack Brooksbank, who spend a lot of time there. Jack has a job there, working in sales and marketing for a very exclusive property development. So they have a connection to the area. It's stunningly beautiful. I'd love to pronounce this correctly. I think Alentejo, is that the...
Well, I am Spanish. I'm not Portuguese.
You're not Portuguese.
But that sounds just about right.
Again, huge apologies to anyone listening from Portugal if I've mispronounced that. But it's a really beautiful part of the Atlantic coastline. You can see why it would hold a great deal of appeal. I mean, they have a pretty good coastline where they are in Montecito already. But I think
California beaches not
but then you want to be in Europe, don't you? You want to be close. You want to be able to travel more, like a little base.
I think so. There are 3 things going on here. One is that they do want some kind of base in Europe, and that makes sense. That they have interests here. Harry has his charity interests in the UK, obviously. Meghan, we know, has her brand launching in the new year. that's going to obviously probably go global. They're going to want a foothold somewhere over here. But the second thing is, they've made it very clear that they don't feel at the moment they can live in the UK or spend any significant amount of time in the UK. So it would make sense to have somewhere else in Europe. And that's due to Harry's ongoing security row with the Home Office. We've covered it many, many times. But I also think that Harry's connection to Eugenie is a really big factor in this. They are very close and always have been. They've remained close throughout this difficult few years. And let's not forget that Eugenie and Jack were there right at the start of Harry and Meghan's relationship. They had that Halloween weekend in Toronto together. They were neighbours at Kensington Palace. Harry and Meghan were at Nottingham Cottage. Jack and Eugenie were at Ivy Cottage, just, stone's throw away. So they've had a very close bond. And now, of course, their children are similar ages. August is almost exactly the same age as Princess Lilibet. So there's a lot that they have in common.
Did Eugenie travel to meet Lilibet after she had been born to Los Angeles?
I think she's certainly been out to Montecito. So it absolutely makes sense that Harry would want to sort of build on that bond that, with the family that he's left behind otherwise. And I think, it is important for him to maintain some kind of connection with the rest of the royal family. So I think that's probably a really big draw for them.
Can't wait to be vacationing in Portugal next year.
Yes, well, I didn't want to mention that Portugal...
That wasn't creepy.
No, it was actually, wasn't it? Yeah, no.
I want to mention that Portugal is gorgeous, but just on top of Portugal is Galicia, where I'm from. So Prince Harry and Meghan, if you want me to host you, I will.
I was going to say, but are they moving there? Because if the answer's no, then...
It's looking quite positive. I'm just
Portugal
saying. It's very close to Galicia, so I'm just doing promotion here for my own, little space in the world.
Other than that,
moving on.
William,
yes.
Big week.
It's a big week for fans of Prince William. We saw last night, I'd been lucky enough to see it a little bit sooner as well, the first episode of his new ITV documentary, Prince William, We Can End Homelessness. And it's been described as a groundbreaking bit of TV, but it's really fascinating because William, is very candid in it, and he's talking a lot about his motivation behind his Homewards initiative and this really bold attempt to prove that it's possible to end homelessness. So, look, I thought it was a really fascinating watch. We're going to hear more in a moment from someone else who took part in it, but I'd be really interested to see in a few years' time how much the fact that he's talking about it and putting it out there and sort of primetime TV will change opinions around this. Because if you think back to the Heads Together campaign that William, Harry and Kate did going back several years now, I really feel that moved the dial on the national conversation around mental health. Mental health is something we all talk about now. But there was a period not very long ago when it was still very taboo and people didn't feel they could be open about any troubles they were experiencing. And I think in many ways, this documentary is going to do the same thing for homelessness. So, look, there's so much we could say about that, but I really think we should bring in our guest this week. Excited. She is an author. She is a fire chief. She's the chief of West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service. She also has a PhD in behavioural neuroscience.
She's a superwoman.
She is a superwoman.
Amazing.
And all this after having experienced homelessness and rough sleeping as a teenager. Let's welcome to the podcast Dr Sabrina Cohen-Hatton. Sabrina, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited that you're with us. I first heard you speaking at a Homewards event earlier this year, and like lots of other people now, have watched you in this new ITV documentary. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to be involved?
Yeah, so it was quite an amazing thing for me, really, because I was approached by the Royal Foundation when they were establishing Homewards, because the Prince was really keen to get people who'd had experience of homelessness in whichever guise. And don't forget, when most people think about homelessness, they think about rough sleeping, but homelessness takes many, many forms. Temporary accommodation, people sleeping in their cars, sofa serving. There's so much hidden homelessness. My experience was rough sleeping. sleeping. I slept rough from the ages of 15, just before I was 16, till about 18. And it was a really difficult period. But I've recovered from homelessness. And the Prince had approached me to help to advise as an advocate for Homewards, to help to give advice so that we're looking at things that can really practically help. And it was such an amazing thing to be asked. And basically, if I said no, it's treason, right? So I had to say
it was the quickest yes.
Yeah. No, it was a real honour. I mean, coming from where I came from, I never imagined in my wildest dreams that I would be invited to be giving advice to the Prince. So yeah, it's amazing.
Can you tell us a bit more about your personal story?
Yeah, of course. I have a backstory that I know is not unique. I grew up in poverty in a single parent household. My father died when I was really young, and my mum really struggled with her mental health. Her business failed and she really, really struggled, and it was an incredibly volatile environment. We had social services back and forth. We were constantly at risk of being taken away, and it was really tough for several years. And by the time I was 15, nearly 16, it was too much to cope with, and I ended up leaving home and sleeping rough on the streets of Newport in South Wales. And for those that don't know Newport, and I can say this with love, and we were giggling about this earlier on, it's a place that is high in crime, high in deprivation, high in drug use, and low in opportunity. It certainly was at the time when I was rough sleeping there. So it's not the kind of place that you want to be vulnerable in. And I was extraordinarily vulnerable as a teenage girl. And I'd sleep in shop doorways. I'd sleep in the porch of a derelict church for a time, and derelict buildings, anywhere where I could get my head down, really. And I can honestly tell you that I've been kicked and punched and spat at more times than I care to remember. It was a really dehumanising and difficult experience. And the practicalities of that are so hard. I was so desperate to not end up in care that I tried really hard to pretend that everything was okay. So I still carried on going to school at one point as well before I left school. And that was really, really difficult. But I had, very limited resources. I had nowhere to sleep. I had nowhere to wash. I had nowhere to clean my clothes. It was literally living hand to mouth. And it was one of the most difficult, most vulnerable, and most dehumanising experiences I could ever describe to you, and not something that I would ever wish on anybody.
Now, I watched several interviews that you've given, and you do speak about why you had a dog, Menace, and when you explained what it meant to you to have a dog, that really opened my eyes, I think, because I'm one of those people, I guess, that sometimes you do see homeless people with dogs and you wonder how that came to be and how you can support each other, but you really explained it really well.
Yeah, Menace meant the world to me. So he was called Menace because he came and found me. I was sat on some concrete steps outside a pub in Newport called the Riverside Pub, and he came running up to me with his tail wagging. He was a stray dog and I was a stray girl, so it kind of seemed to work. And he jumped up on me and started licking my face, and I literally fell back and I went, "Oh, you're a bloody menace," and then it stuck. So he was an amazing dog. And there are a number of reasons for me why that connection was so important. And I know many, many people, as you say, will have a view on those experiencing homelessness with a dog. And my goodness me, I experienced hostility from people on a daily basis. People would say, you only have a dog for pity, or you have a dog because you're trying to get more money from people, and the most ridiculous, hostile things. And, you can't look after yourself. How can you look after a dog? And, it was really difficult. But my relationship with that dog, he was the only social and emotional connection I had at a time when I was otherwise completely isolated. And that connection meant the world to me. He was my reason to get up in the morning. He was my reason to carry on. And he gave me such a sense of warmth and acceptance in a world where I really felt like I was completely on the periphery. And, there were some really important times in that, because I honestly think, looking back, because I had that connection with him, I wasn't seeking a connection with other people who would have sought to exploit my vulnerability. And believe me, there were plenty. Right. And I saw it happen to women around me that went for the wrong connection with the wrong person, and they wanted to get something from the woman, and they ended up hooked on drugs and moving into being exploited in the most awful ways. But I never connected with people like that because I had my dog. and I would just avoid people, to be honest. So he was everything to me. And actually, there's another piece to that, because when I then moved into secure accommodation eventually after a few false starts, but when I did get somewhere and I started to move into what felt like the next phase of my life, the recovery from homelessness, that for me was so much harder than just surviving day to day, because you have to try to rethink yourself and try to trust people in a way that you found really hard for such a long time. And you have to think about how you can become part of a society that you felt so excluded from for so long. And for me, I hid a huge part of who I was, but the constant that I had was Menace. He was always there with me. And he died an old dog. He was about 14 years old. He'd actually got hit by a car, and the car drove off. And but he was super, super old. But he saw me in my first home. He saw me eventually buying a house. He was even still alive when my daughter was born. So he was a real constant in my life.
I wanted to ask actually about the moment that things started changing for you. How and when and why did that happen?
It was really hard. So there wasn't a huge amount of support that I could access. There may well have been support available, but it certainly wasn't there in a way that I could readily access. And don't forget, I tried to hide my homelessness for a significant proportion of the time because I was afraid of going into care. So by the time I was 16, probably closer to 17 actually, I went to social services again to see if I could find my own social worker. He wasn't there, and someone in the office said he doesn't work here anymore and kind of shooed me out the door. That's how it felt at the time anyway. And they said, why don't you see if you can get a council house? So I went to see whether I could go on a council housing list, but I was already experiencing homelessness, so I'm not a priority, which I kind of understand in retrospect because it is a really horrible experience. So I would want to prevent that from anyone else going through that. So I understand it. But they said, why don't you see if you can access some benefits? So I went down to the old DSS office as it was then, and they said, no, because you're under 18, you can only have £15 a fortnight bridging allowance. So by that point, I told them what they could do with their £15 a fortnight bridging allowance. I went on my merry way. But
good for you.
For me, it was selling the big issue that was the thing for me that helped me out of that situation. And what people might not realise about the big issue is you don't get given those magazines. You have to buy them. You're buying stock and then you sell it on for a profit. So every big issue vendor that you see is essentially a micro entrepreneur. They're buying stock in and they're selling it on for a profit, and they're reinvesting that profit to buy more stock and starting their day again. And I started selling it in Newport, but there were, I don't know, maybe about 12 other people also selling it in Newport. So there's a lot of competition. So eventually I found a place called Monmouth, which was about an hour away on a bus, and there was no one else selling it there. So I could buy a wodge of magazines and I'd get on a bus at 7 o'clock in the morning. I'd be there till 7 o'clock at night sometimes until I'd sold them all. And that gave me an opportunity to save up enough to eventually put down a deposit on a cheap rented flat in the South Wales Valleys. There were a few false starts. I had a room in a shared house for a very short period, but I got attacked by another tenant and he put me in hospital. The police came, pulled him off and took me to hospital, and I didn't feel safe there after that, so I left. And of course, the other problem is when you're rough sleeping or you've been rough sleeping and then you have accommodation. For me, I felt really bad that everyone else was still sleeping out. So I'd let people stay over and places would get trashed, and it was really tricky. And then for a while I slept in a van. I'm not quite sure how I'm still alive actually, because I had a Cala gas heater in there and I had no idea that it was dangerous to leave a Cala gas heater on all night. I know. But that at least gave me a bit more security. And then eventually I was able to get this flat myself. And I moved to the South Wales Valleys to a place called Risca because it felt like I could have a fresh start. I didn't know anyone there. I didn't have any connections there. And to be honest, I hid the fact that I'd experienced homelessness for literally decades because I wanted a fresh start. I didn't want people to judge me. I would still carry a huge sense of shame. I had nothing to be ashamed of, don't get me wrong, but it's that feeling that you have and it's that emotional response. And that's why for me, that recovery from homelessness is so difficult, and it's so much more intense, I think, for me than it was to necessarily move out of homelessness. It's how you then reintegrate again. And that's when I started to think about the fire service, actually, because for me, being a firefighter is an enormous privilege. And I felt like, in a funny kind of way, being a firefighter, you're trusted by people to know what to do when they're at their lowest, when they're having the worst day they've ever had. And I felt like I could relate to that because of my experience. So I think I wanted to help people in a way that no one had been able to help me.
Now,
That's amazing.
You hid your homelessness for 20 years. Was that, once you opened up about it, was that when you felt that you had recovered? Or, because I feel like if holding something hidden for so long, I feel like you don't get to kind of put it to rest kind of thing.
Yeah. In truth, it's always there.
Yeah.
I did hide it for a really long time. And in fact, I used to have stress dreams about people finding out about it.
Yeah.
I would literally wake up in a cold sweat. I was so afraid. But for me, that was a real turning point. And the point that I kept thinking about is that there are so many other people in that same place today that I once was. And I wanted them to know that their circumstances don't have to define them.
Yeah.
It doesn't determine the place that you end up, just the position that you start from. But it took for me to get to a really kind of senior, secure position, I think, in my own profession before I had the confidence to say, okay, I'm going to bear all and be completely vulnerable by telling you this thing that's made me feel really insecure. And I used to look at other leaders in my industry who were these amazing people who never seemed to make a mistake, who always knew what to say and do. And I could never imagine, being as good as one of them, because there was something that made me feel super vulnerable. And if that's happening to me, how many other people?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to have anything as extreme as street homelessness to know that they've got, or to feel a vulnerability. And part of this is about a step change to say, actually, it's okay to talk about these things. And that, for me, is why Homewards is so powerful. It's challenging the stigma associated with homelessness. It's changing the narrative in relation to homelessness. So I hope that the journey for other people out of homelessness, that recovery, might not be as difficult because of the work that Homewards is doing. And I think for me, that's a really powerful thing.
You mentioned before that when you were homeless, there wasn't really any resources available. Do you think that's changed?
Do you know, there are some amazing frontline workers and some amazing charities out there that are doing incredible work. The numbers of people experiencing homelessness are still rising. The economic situation is really challenging for people today, and housing continues to be a challenge. So there are resources there. Whether they're enough is another question, and whether they are provided in a way that people are able to access is another really difficult challenge. When we were filming the documentary, I found an amazing organisation called Housing First that are part of the Salvation Army in Cardiff. And they've really looked at helping entrenched rough sleepers in a completely different way. And when I was talking to them, what they were telling me is that for most people to be able to access housing that are rough sleeping, they need to have achieved a load of different things. They need to have, gone to meetings at particular times. They need to be off drugs. They need to have all of these things lined up. And if they fail, and bearing in mind, when you're rough sleeping, life is really chaotic. But if they fail, then you're kind of back to the bottom of the list again. And what they recognised is actually you might be able to identify how to prioritise limited resources that way, but you might not be having the maximum impact to help people in a really effective way. So they look at it completely differently, and they really tailor their support. They put someone in housing first. That's the first premise. So you have that secure base, and they tailor and wrap a huge amount of support around an individual to help them transition from rough sleeping to hopefully reintegrating and finding skills, finding employment, but a different life. And that's really amazing. And so one of the things that I really admire about the way Homewards is approaching this is it's bringing people around the table who are already invested in ending homelessness in some way. And they're putting everyone around the table and saying, this is the problem. Let's look at it in a different way. How can we look at this differently? And it's really focused on solutions. So, I mean, in an ideal world, I'd love to flood it with resources. I would love to, but I know that that's not real. So actually, what can we do with what we have to look at this differently and try and be as effective as we can?
Now, viewers of the documentary will see you taking Wayne to Windsor to meet the Prince. Now, this is someone who you've spoken to in the documentary who's been helped by Housing First. Can you tell us a bit about what that was like?
Oh, it was amazing. So one of the things that was really important to me about becoming an advocate was to be a really active advocate, was to do things that might be helpful. And the Prince set us a task and he said, go out and find me solutions, find things that work. And that's what led me to Housing First. And Wayne was an entrenched rough sleeper. He'd been rough sleeping on and off for many, many years. He was addicted to drugs. He was an alcoholic. He'd been in and out of prison. He would burgle to fund a drugs habit and had a really chaotic life, completely estranged from his family breakdown. And when Housing First found him, Gemma, his support worker, he was literally 7 stone soaking wet on the side of the road, and she scooped him up in a blanket and took him to the hospital. And his journey started from there. But he'd gone from that to now being completely off drugs. He's drinking very, very minimally, and his next ambition is to give up alcohol completely. And he's in a house. He's reconnected with his family, with his daughter and his grandchildren.
Oh.
And I really wanted the Prince to meet him so that he could see for himself the impact of some of the incredible work that's already happening out there and look at how we could scale that up. So when I first suggested it to Wayne and Gemma, they were excited, but also a little bit anxious, as you can imagine. And when we took them to Windsor, it was really, really lovely. We were sat talking to them beforehand, and Wayne was saying how he'd been trying on lots of different shirts and suits the night before and was really super excited. And the Prince came in and he instantly put everyone at ease. He's so good like that. And Wayne was able to tell his story and was able to really clearly articulate the amazing impact that Gemma personally and Housing First as an organisation had on him. Mm-hmm. And I think it was really great for the Prince to be able to see that, because one of the things that I really feel passionately about with both Wayne and Vincent, who's another entrenched rough sleeper that we meet in the documentary, is that they're of a demographic, middle-aged man who has been completely sidelined by society and written off. And I saw people writing Vincent off as they were walking past him in the street when we were stood talking to him. And it's, it really took me back to how I felt when I was in that situation. But some of the people that really helped me at that time were older men, entrenched rough sleepers who were exactly the same demographic. And it was the same people that others would be crossing the street to try and avoid. And they really helped me. So I felt really strongly about, with the work that we're doing with Homewards, about not writing anyone off, because everybody has value. And for me, Wayne is living proof of this. And to be able to show the Prince that, to really viscerally be able to see the difference that we can make if we get this right, it was fantastic. And for me, being able to make sure that Wayne has his truth heard, not just by the Prince, but by everyone that's going to watch that documentary. I hope that it'll challenge some perceptions, because, we touched on how difficult that recovery from homelessness is. And I heard an amazing phrase once, and it's that you can't wash poverty off your skin. And it's so true. And it's the same for me with your experience of homelessness. You're always holding it there. Because as much as you want to say, do you know what, I don't care what people think of me. There are 7-8 billion people in the world. Why should I care about the opinions of one? The reality is, when you're experiencing homelessness, you have so many negative perceptions hurled at you, negative responses from people. And that we absorb that as social information. We're human beings who are hardwired to absorb that as social information. And that informs the way that we expect the next person to respond to us. It becomes part of our inner narrative and how we speak to ourselves. So when you're recovering from homelessness, it's not just, the resources and the life skills, learning how to cook a meal and how to budget so that you can pay your rent and your electricity on time, but it's also how you then can see yourself differently. It's really hard. And so, I think for people to be able to see that and perhaps be a bit more challenged and nuanced with their thinking when they're thinking about someone experiencing homelessness, I hope it will inform people's lenses differently.
Why do you think Prince William is the right person to lead this campaign? He's had some criticism for it, which he addresses in the documentary. Why do you think he is powerful in this position?
for me, it's his convening power. You can't underestimate how powerful it is to be able to get people around the table. And that's what he's able to do brilliantly. And I've seen it in Technicolor. He gets people sat around a table that wouldn't ordinarily be there and trying to address a tricky problem in a completely different way. And I've heard the criticism, and you know, it frustrated me a little bit, because I wish that I had the luxury, you know, having experienced homelessness myself, of saying, well, sorry, you're too privileged to be able to help out with this. What a luxury to be able to say, sorry, I'm going to turn down your help because you're too posh to help. That is ridiculous. So for me, I would much rather have a monarch that recognises a social problem and uses his platform to challenge that, which is exactly what he's doing, rather than sit back and enjoy the privilege. And I'm really proud, actually, to have a monarch that does that.
I love seeing Prince William, he's such an active listener to just like everyone in all walks of life, isn't he? It's kind of like, introducing those men to him that they would all be, really put at ease by him. And yeah, that's exactly what happens, isn't it? Yeah.
He is wonderful like that. And I think that just the ability to be able to recognise a problem, and for me, he is really, really committed to challenging the human impact of this. You know, he really genuinely cares. And there's a lot that he does that people don't see as well, you know, with visits to various places, meeting people experiencing homelessness, and it's all done away from the cameras as well. Yeah. So for me, he's really genuinely committed to helping to challenge this problem. And for me, it's a massive privilege to be able to support in some way, along with the other advocates and along with all of those organisations who've actually said, yeah, do you know what? We're up for the challenge here.
William knows a bit about trauma. Do you think this helps him connect with people?
I think so. One of the things that I touch on in the documentary is that you don't have to have experienced homelessness to be able to genuinely empathise with people who are experiencing homelessness today. And one of the contributing factors to homelessness, in whichever guise, whether it's rough sleeping, whether it's sofa surfing, whether you've lost your home and you can't get housing and you're stuck in a hotel, which many, many people are as well, whatever has led you to that point, trauma is very often involved in some way.
Yeah.
And actually, just not having that security of a base is really traumatic in itself. And one of the things that I think the Prince really brings to this is, because he's experienced his own trauma, I think he's really good at being able to relate to how that affects somebody, you know, how it affects you at your core. And I certainly see that with the work that he's doing with Homewards, and the way that he is able to really kind of think about not just the kind of strategy of an issue, but every conversation I've ever had with him has always started with the people who are experiencing it, and how we can make that different.
He has a big ambition here to end homelessness. That's what his goal is. Do you think it's possible?
I think it's absolutely possible. When you look at some of the amazing things that have happened in places like Finland and how successful they've been with reducing homelessness. And actually, for me, why shouldn't that be the ambition? Because if you have an ambition that's any less, then you're saying any amount of homelessness is okay, and it's not. So for me, even if we're able to demonstrate how it's possible and then able to scale that up in other areas, that is a massive step forward from where we are. So for me, it's about what should be the goal. And I don't think any of us would accept any form of homelessness as a level of acceptability. So I think it's absolutely the right ambition. And now is about how we are able to push there, how we're able to get there, how we're able to coalesce people, how we're able to do things differently, to be able to actually, operationalize that and achieve that.
Now, he became involved with homeless charities when he was young, with his mother. And I'm sure he's had these conversations with his own children. And I know you mentioned before that you have a daughter, and we spoke before, and I have young kids too. And we were saying how, I'll speak for myself, as an adult, you become used to seeing homeless people and you just carry on with your day. But it's thanks to my kids now that they keep asking me questions and they keep bringing it, to my attention, like, why is this happening? Why can't we help them? And, I always think it's kind of so difficult. I'm getting a bit emotional, sorry. So difficult. Oh, I'm so sorry. To help everyone, even though, you want to. Tell us a bit, what can we do or what can we tell our kids?
It's a really good point. And when I started to talk about my experience, my daughter was, she was about 8 or 9. So I can completely, I started to choke up there when you were saying that. So I was like, I've been there, I know what you mean.
It's just the world's so messed up.
I know.
And you kind of forget until you have kids, then they remind you every day of everything that's wrong with the world. And
you're so right, though, because everyone, you do get used to it, and then
become
it's
almost immune.
It's not, but it's you desensitized maybe, and then it takes something like having children seeing it too.
But also hearing an account like yours, because we don't often hear from the people in question.
Yeah.
So what would your advice be? Yeah.
Do you know, when having been there, none of us expect someone to be able to kind of swan in and sweep us away and make it all right. We know that nobody has a magic wand. So we're not expecting people that are walking past daily to be able to have all of the fixes. When I was sat there, one of the things that made such a difference was even something like making eye contact and speaking to me at a time when I felt so dehumanized, and abuse in all forms was a regular daily thing. There was kindness too, don't get me wrong, but there was also a lot of abuse. And we know with the human brain that for every one negative experience, you need about 5 to 7 positive experiences to balance it out. So, people really do feel the negative responses. So even something as small as asking me my name, made such a difference to me that day. I used to find it hard when people walked past, and I can understand why they do, don't get me wrong. But I just felt so invisible. So for me, it's about how you can humanize somebody that day, talking to me, asking me my name, just saying hello. You don't even have to stop and spend half an hour of your day having a conversation if you don't want to, but just acknowledge me, acknowledge that I'm there. I always used to really appreciate it if someone would, ask me if I was hungry and whether I'd want some. I've been so hungry that I've literally pulled hot dogs out of bins before now. So, just the fact that someone would then ask me what I want gave me a kind of level, I am a person. I am worthy of, having a choice of what I get to eat today. That made a really big difference to me as well. And I know that people will have varying views on whether they should give money to people experiencing street homelessness in particular. Most of the big charities would say to donate to them because they're doing the work that can help people experiencing homelessness, and they have a point. I take a slightly different view, having been there as well. For me, just having the resources to get through that day was really important. So I personally really appreciated it when people did give me money, but by no means am I saying that everybody should. It's completely a personal choice. But just sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference.
Thank you. Sorry about before.
No, please.
No, don't be sorry.
Sabrina, thank you so much. I mean, I think we could definitely keep you here all day.
Yes.
So many questions. Congratulations on the documentary. And we're very excited to see where Homewards goes next, and we'd love to have you back.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.
Do come back, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Sabrina and to you two for joining us. We'll be back soon.
In the meantime, you can catch more from Hello with our entertainment show, The Daily Lowdown, available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. Bye.